We acknowledge, celebrate and pay our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First People on whose traditional lands we meet and work. Their cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We also acknowledge and celebrate that many of the speakers in this series were based on other traditional lands and territories across Australia and the world. We recognise their past and present leaders and acknowledge their contribution to our collective past and futures. Welcome to Cybernetics Snacks, a speaker series featuring leading voices in the cybernetics conversation. We're currently exploring the past, present and future of cybernetics. A rich feast for the senses, bringing together British artists' history and cybernetics. Today, we're in conversation with Catherine Mason. We've asked Catherine 4 questions. Let's see what she has to say.
I first became interested in the history of cybernetics when I joined an art research project at Birkbeck, University of London. This was in 2002. And I come from a relatively traditional art history background. So science and technology as influences upon art didn't really figure in my early education. But as part of the CASH project, I obviously became very interested in cybernetics. So CASH stands for Computer Arts, Context, Histories, etc. And here you can see one of our old archive pages from the early 2000s. And it rapidly became apparent that there was a whole history that had been largely overlooked by the canon of art history. And there are many, many artists who'd been lost in obscurity. And here on our card, you can see one of them, Edward Ignatovich, working at University College London in around 1970. He was an artist in residence in the mechanical engineering lab. And here he is creating his masterwork, really, the Sensor, which was a computer-controlled interactive robotic sculpture. So, and again, here I've got some other pictures. It was installed in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And you can see some audiences interacting with it down on the lower right of the screen there. So together with colleagues for 4 years, I sought to reclaim this area of artistic practice and try and bring some of these artists' stories to light. And when I began down this road, I must say that nobody was really very much interested. But now I'm pleased to say that things are starting to change, and I'll mention a little bit more about that at the end. But when I was beginning this new field, for me, this whole new field of science and technology within art, the main question really became, how did artists come to use computers and digital information technologies? And what did it look like? And so in considering this question, I found that at least the answer partly lies in the post-war science of cybernetics, and particularly its strong links with British art schools and other educational establishments. And this is largely due to issues of access. So what we're going to see in this session is a particularly British interpretation of art, informed by systems and technological processes, which eventually become more focused in the late 50s and into the 1970s. Well, this is a very huge field, and in this short space of time, I'm really only going to be able to mention some of the main points, but I hope this will give you an idea of the wealth of activity that took place during this period and some of the reasons behind it. Well, in the immediate post-war period, there were no computers available to artists, but there was a great wealth of thinking about cybernetics. And this influenced subsequent generations. And a computational way of thinking about art production began to take shape. So as we're going to see, this concept had a profound impact on artists by giving them a framework within which they could consider the use of new technologies. And much of this work, it was experimental and collaborative. In fact, this collaborative aspect came to define the early days of computer arts activities. So post-war, computers were obviously at an early stage in their development, and they were commonly thought of as number crunchers or referred to as electric brains. And not only was it difficult to access this equipment, at this stage, it really was difficult to perceive of the computer as being an art method or material at all. But the new scientific development of cybernetics was able to inform this gestation of ideas. So for artists interested in what we would probably now call art and technology, cybernetics primarily meant 3 things. control. And this would be allowing a way of exerting control over the art making process itself, and or as a means to actually control the work, as a mechanism to make things happen within the artwork. Well, communication, secondly, that is kind of self-evident for, I think, for artists in general, the appeal of communication. But most importantly is the notion of feedback. And this allows the possibility of interactivity. And therefore, artists are going to be able to connect more closely with the viewer and the audience if they're able to interact. And feedback gave this possibility steam. So cybernetics really gave an opportunity for interdisciplinary activity and cooperation. And this was really of great value to artists who were already interested in using new tools. Because initially, artists, of course, needed help to access the technology. And they sometimes also required help to run it. But with the field of cybernetics, different disciplines could now have a shared vocabulary, and this could apply to many different fields. Of inspiration here, of course, was the American Norbert Wiener, as well as developments within the UK. Well, according to Wiener, at a basic level, cybernetics refers to the set of problems centered about communication, control, and statistical mechanics, whether in the machine or in living tissue. For artists in particularly, this included communication within an observer and between the observer and their environment. So on both sides of the Atlantic, the potential that cybernetics held for creating improvements in complex systems was very quickly recognized. And Wiener's book was hugely far-reaching, and these notions of control, feedback, and communication really penetrated almost every aspect of technical culture in the post-war period. In the UK, of course, the most intellectually powerful and influential cybernetics grouping was the Ratio Club, started in Cambridge in 1949. And this included psychiatrists, neurologists, mathematicians, engineers, and a very large cross-disciplinary group of people. And this helped, they were interested in new ways of thinking about behavior-generating mechanisms and information processing in brains as well as machines, so in the human as well as in the mechanics. Members included Alan Turing, who you can see seated there on the far left of your screen, universally regarded as one of the fathers of computer science and artificial intelligence. At this time, Alan Turing was working on one of the world's first stored program computers at Manchester. Also, Jack Good was a member, and he'd worked on top secret code cracking at Bletchley Park. And of interest for artists, particularly, was W. Ross Ashby and his very influential book, Design for a Brain, from 1952, very important book. Ashby created a homeostat machine, which was a system that could respond to changes in conditions and maintain its own stability. And this is often considered the earliest device to be created with the capacity to adapt to its own environment. So it was made of repurposed RAF bomb control units and filled with water, and it automatically adapted its configuration to stabilize the effects of any disturbances introduced into its system. Time magazine called this homeostat machine the closest thing to a synthetic brain so far designed by man. So we can see that these were interests that held a lot of appeal for not just thinking people, but also lay people. Another Ratio Club member of interest to artists at this time was William Gray Walter, who produced these mechanical tortoises. And these were some of the first electronic autonomous robots. They were three-wheeled and they followed lights. And this particular example you're seeing here was created for the Festival of Britain in 1951. And they were used as tools to study ideas about how the brain might function. Many other people belong to the Ratio Club. Sadly, we don't have time to go into them today, but I just wanted to show that it was this atmosphere of enormous energy and optimism that pervaded post-war Britain as it began to rebuild. These people were very hungry to push science in new and important directions. And cybernetics rapidly developed from what might be a specific field of scientific interest to become more of a household word and a concept that covered a whole gamut of expectations about the future in the 1950s, particularly in the art world. Well, cybernetics was impacting the visual arts from about mid-1950s onwards. And it is noteworthy that the first artists who began to investigate this came from a constructivist or a Bauhaus influenced background. And here you can see some of those who fall into that category. And these are the independent group members of the mid-1950s. The independent group was a loose gathering of artists, designers, architects, and theorists, and they were centered around the Institute of Contemporary Art, the ICA, in London. They were inspired by a wide range of subjects, including scientific developments and popular and particularly American culture. Members included Eduardo Paolozzi, who you can see there in the middle of this photograph, also Nigel Henderson, who's on the far right, William Turnbull, Richard Hamilton, Lawrence Alloway, who was an art historian, Rayner Banham, and the Smithsons, Peter and Alison Smithson. Alison is sitting in the middle of this picture here. And they really represented, again, a cross-section of the visual arts theory and criticism and history and design. So again, it was a kind of an interdisciplinary grouping. You would maybe kind of think of it as a sort of ratio club for avant-garde art in the day. Many of these artists had become familiar with technology doing work during the war. So various technologies that they encountered during the war. But they all generally believed that visual culture did not exist in a vacuum. And it was instead, visual culture is informed by relation to science and technology. But this, I must say, was not an obvious approach at this time. These people were very avant-garde in their way of thinking. This was not the norm in the British art world, or indeed any art world anywhere around the world at this point. Just to give you an example, they invited British cybernetics expert E.W. Meyer to talk about probability and information theory and their application to the visual arts. And this was in March 1955. And this talk was so profound for one of the members, John McHale, that he started making diagrams and collages on the theme of the transistor. The transistor had just recently been invented, and it had revolutionized telecommunications. So here you can see one of the John McHale collages from this time. On the far left is transistor from the Tate. And these were collages of reassembled materials from mass media. So magazine cutouts, pieces of ephemera, bits of printed materials that had been collected by the artist and put together in a collage format. He wanted to create new types of technological automata. So these are neither human, they're neither machines. In fact, he said that they were out of Frankenstein by way of IBM. Now, later, McHale went to the United States on a Yale University scholarship, and that picture that you're seeing on the far right there, Machine Made America, that is one that dates from that period when he was in the States. He went to study under Joseph Albers, who was a former Bauhaus master. Well, John McHale and Richard Hamilton were both interested in machines, mechanisms of all kinds, and ready-made articles, particularly pertaining to mechanics. And in this, they were inspired by Siegfried Gideon and his book, Mechanization Takes Command, from 1948. And this was a history of pre-industrial, right from pre-industrial revolution times through to factory assembly lines, mechanized agriculture. Siegfried Gideon even talks about domestic concerns like food, furniture, housing, this kind of thing. And he asks the question, what does mechanization mean to mankind? And he included in his book some scientific diagrams, and he drew parallels with art. So on the right-hand side there, I've done a page from the book, and you can see at the top is a cyclograph image recording the path through space of a fencing sword, the point of a fencing sword. And this is shown underneath, on top of a Kandinsky painting. And here Siegfried Gideon is drawing parallels between the movement of the sword and the abstract shapes that the artist is creating. So he was very interested, and there are several examples throughout the book of art being inserted into this history of mechanization, really. I'll give you a quote. Siegfried Gideon suggested that artists should resort to elements such as machines, mechanisms, and ready-made articles as some of the few true products of the period to liberate themselves from the ruling taste. So again, that really is almost exactly what Mick Hale did. And indeed Richard Hamilton, use elements from contemporary life. So what you have here is really the beginnings of what we might call a human-machine interface. And this was seen as the most modern way you could produce art at this time. The most forward-looking way of things you could do in art was to use a human-machine interface. One of the results of this was an exhibition by Richard Hamilton, again, another member of the independent group. His Man, Machine, in Motion exhibition of 1955 was really about the synergy of the human and the machine. And in the catalog, he writes, the relation between man and machine is a kind of union. The two act together like a single creature. Now, this show contained approximately 220 mainly photographic documents from all periods of history. And this was about illustrating the technical evolution of human mobility. So we have got land, space, underwater, and in the air. And you can see this is the picture on the top here is a shot from the exhibition, an installation view of the exhibition. And you've got an underwater diving apparatus there on the right, lower right. And then you've got, I can see airplanes and things at the back. So he covered these three aspects of life for man using technology throughout history. And then running along the bottom of the screen is a little leaflet and a private view card that was given out for the exhibition. And you can see that even here, which we're talking 1955, he's even thinking about being on the moon. So that picture down the bottom there is some men wearing moon masks, moon suits. So these were pictures drawn from mass media or ready-made found imagery by Hamilton. He just collated these pieces together. He didn't actually create anything new. What was new was the way of putting it, installing it in the exhibition, and indeed of collating this material, because as we know, this was something which was an entirely new way of looking at the art world. It was an attempt to bring art and science together with the aim of demonstrating what they have in common. And he'd been interested in this for quite a long time, Hamilton. Here's an exhibition he did a few years before called Growth and Form. And this demonstrates his long-standing interest in science. And this was the ICA's contribution to the Festival of Britain in 1951. So again, all of this is seen as the latest, the most modern and up-to-date, and therefore most positive aspects of humanity at this time. And he was, of course, inspired here by Darcy Wentworth Thompson's book on growth and form. Thompson looked at the way that things grow and the shapes that they take. This is the study of morphogenesis. And this was highly influential in the art world, this book, and it still is today. And you can think of people like Daniel Brown, Richard Brown, Andy Lomas, who are still young artists who are still very much interested in this idea of growth and form, coming directly from this Darcy Thompson book, which was published around 1907. Well, Hamilton's exhibition, you can see on the right-hand side of this screen an installation view of Hamilton's show. This was an attempt to bring the arts and sciences together again, and he presented scientific imagery as an aesthetic experience. So there's pictures, photographs of microscopic life forms. He also had on view some X-rays and some bones and different shapes that looked like that. So he was really interested in showing bones, for example, for their aesthetic shapes, their interest in aesthetics, as well as their human interest. And the display itself, you can see, again, a little bit like man-machine motion, which was to happen a few years later. The display itself was very, again, very new. So instead of hanging works of art on the wall around all four sides of the wall, rather he makes something which is an immersive display, so you can walk through this. You're sort of almost inside the exhibition. And again, that is very, very new, that idea of an immersive environment. So both of these exhibitions were revolutionary, and they'd not been seen before in the art world. And they were the first of a series of landmark exhibitions bringing together arts and sciences that were staged at the ICA right up until 1968. But before we get to 1968, we need to have a look at This Is Tomorrow, which was 1956. And again, this was a collaboration of the independent group. And this was put on at the Whitechapel Art Gallery and has particular relevance for the birth of computer art. Now, one of the key themes for this show was design and communication and the breaking down of traditional barriers. The artists believed that these traditional barriers in art that they saw limited their efficiency as artists and made collaboration difficult. So collaboration was something that they were very much interested in. And they saw the traditional means in art to be limiting their efficiency in achieving collaboration. So here you got a poster on the left-hand side of Richard Hamilton for the exhibition. And again, he's using collage and a wide variety of found collaged imagery from sources, popular magazines, right up to space. And that's actually the edge of the moon that you can see there on the left-hand side at the very top of that poster. But for particular relevance to the history of computer art, what is the most fascinating is the catalog, and that's what you're looking at the cover of on the right-hand side of this screen. Now, inside this catalog, under section 12, there is this chart. And here we can see these young artists' belief in the power of modern technologies. So they're presenting us a chart which deals with potential tools and methods of practice. So for example, you've got physical objects arranged in or on, operated or produced by. So as well as simple things like physical objects such as marks, arranged in or on paper, operated or produced by a pencil or chalk. You also, if you go down the list there, you will see we've got things like physical objects, counter wheels, punch tape cards, magnetic surfaces, wired tape and discs, arranged in or on, desk calculating machines, punched card machines, and just general machinery, operated or produced by motor and input instructions. So this is really the very first time that a reference to any kind of thing like a computer is made in the British art world as being a material or a method for producing art. So this is 1956, and this is the first time that this is written down. Now, of course, the irony is that we're looking at this little page from the catalog, and this has been typed out on a typewriter, and it's been drawn with lines and created a chart by hand. However, these artists realized that this would be the future and that there is something going on here that they needed to address. Of course, in 1956, there's no way they can get a hold of any kind of computing machinery at this stage, but they can start to think about it. Now, later on, a few pages later in the catalog, we see a reference to Edmund C. Berkeley and his concept of a machine as a giant brain. So again, this is another key as to the way these artists were thinking about art production. Well, Edmund Berkeley was an American who published a popular book called Giant Brains or Machines That Think. And I particularly love this graphic that he has on this early edition, which is a man's head, a person's head, literally plugged into a sort of big square, which I suppose kind of looks like might be some type of computing equipment, very much stylized, and it's feeding right directly into his head. This book, Machines That Think, Giant Brains, was both a primer and a manifesto, and in it, Berkeley described digital concepts such as binary and input and output. It was really a book for an introduction, really, a way that people who were non-specialists could understand this. And on the left-hand, the left-hand side, you've got a publicity material for the book, and it really is emphasizing the futuristic aspects of such subjects. Now, Berkeley published a chart in this book, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. And this chart seems to have had direct influence upon the independent group because his chart is labeled physical equipment for handling information. So he talks about sounds and marks and inscriptions and letters and pebbles and how they would be arranged and how they would be operated or produced. And then what costs they would be. Are they low cost? Are they permanent? Would they be erasable? You know, this sort of thing. So this, for an artist, you can imagine, is quite thrilling at this time. So we can see that the young artist's belief in the power of modern technologies, even emergent ones like punch cards, for which the exact artistic employment could not have been clear at this time, was still very inspiring to these people. Now, Richard Hamilton, here's a close-up of the Berkeley chart, which inspired the independent group's catalog from This Is Tomorrow. So you can see things like counter wheels, gears, lights, etc., desk calculating machine, operator produced by motor and hands, and then it gets a number of ticks depending on whether it's low cost, does it take up very much space, how permanent is it erasable, is it versatile, etc. Very inspiring for artists. Well, Richard Hamilton himself went on to teach at King's College, Newcastle, upon Tyne in 1963. And together with Victor Passmore, he set up and ran a basic design course. Now, this was an entirely new type of art education. Basic design built upon the Bauhaus concept of an integrated method of teaching to train artists and craftspeople to participate in expanding industrial society. And it placed emphasis on learning through experimentation, and it focused on the student rather than the curriculum, on the process of learning rather than the results, and on the value of group enterprise rather than individual endeavor. So here again, we have this notion of cooperation. Now, there had been courses of basic design before, for example, at Camberwell School of Arts and Crafts and at the Central School, and several independent members had taught on those courses. But here at King's College in Newcastle, this was the most radical and progressive art education available in Britain at this time. And here you can see Victor Passmore, who was another one of the tutors on the course, working on a mural for the Festival of Britain in 1951. Now, Victor Passmore himself had moved from an impressionistic, figurative style of painting to pure abstraction based on principles of constructivism. And he was at this time really one of the, if not the most leading abstract painter in Britain. He believed that a basic modern course should assume a relative outlook in which only the beginning is defined and not the end. You can also see here some of Richard Hamilton's lecture slides from the course. And here he's putting up, these are 35mm slides, which he would use to discuss with students. And here he's got on the right-hand side, you can see an advertisement for the Ford motor car. And on the left-hand side, it looks like an early form of airplane. So again, he's talking about the fact that Ford motor cars, for example, have as much myth and fantasy in them as any traditional subjects in history. And again, this is part of the fusion of machine and human and the formulation of a new mythology, what we might even call a technological superhuman. Now, here's some student work from this course. And again, this is a unique concept in art education at this time. There was no more copying from plaster casts and studying of the old masters. This is what had dominated art education prior to this, the founding of the Royal Academy, you can think about, for example. So instead, basic design attempted to take into account revolutionary developments of modern art, including American abstract expressionism, as well as popular culture and advertising and movies and so on. Now, these two exercises you're looking at here, we don't have the name of the artist. They're just, unfortunately, they're anonymous. They're unsigned. They are showing exercises in media dexterity, becoming au fait and handling different types of media. Well, the influence of cybernetics spread to other art schools and eventually into polytechnics as the students themselves went on to teach. For example, one of Richard Hamilton's students was Roy Ascot on the basic design course. Well, Roy Ascot becomes very important pioneer, really, in the history of cybernetic art in Britain. And he was influenced by the radar technology that he'd encountered during his national service in the RAF. And this was inspired by Passmore's constructivism, and he also incorporated an interactive element into his work that reflected his interest in communications and the theory of cybernetics. He said, "We are moving towards a fully cybernated society where processes of retroaction, instant communication, automatic flexibility will inform every aspect of our environment." So he created early on these change paintings. Now here he is taking something of the abstract expressionism gestural painting of Jackson Pollock, and he is changing that into an interactive mode of artwork. So there was a big Jackson Pollock retrospective at the Whitechapel in 1958. But understood in the light of cybernetics, Roy Ascot saw art as a system, which includes the painter, the art creator, as well as the viewer. It's a system including both, and they are interconnected, and there is feedback between the two. So what he's doing here with his change paintings, again, this is long before anyone is able to access, any artists are able to access computing technology in the UK. But here he's able to create something which is interactive by means of perspex sheets. So you can see down on the lower right of the screen, there is a viewer at an exhibition that he held, moving these sheets with painted symbols on them back and forth within a frame. So you could change them. You could make your own painting if you like, and every person's painting was slightly different within a certain number of parameters, obviously. Now, Ascot went on to create his own art course called the Ground Course at Ealing College of Art. And this was a type of second generation basic course, I think you could call it. He called it the Ground Course to emphasize learning from the ground up. And this was among the first of the new foundation courses brought about by the result of the Coldstream Report of 1960, which revolutionized the art education system in Britain and brought it up to date. It reformed the whole art and design education sector. And in fact, foundation courses to this day remain an integral and important part of British art education. Well, Ascot's was a revolutionary course. He was trying to better equip his students for what he saw as a cybernetic world that was rapidly becoming a fact. And to a large degree, he felt that life was going to become automated and human perception was going to be mediated through a wide range of mechanisms. Here you can see some of his students on some kind of collaborative art project there. He produced a paper called The Construction of Change in 1964. And you can see here, he says, cybernetics is concerned with what things do and how they do them, and with the processes within which they behave. It takes a dynamic view of life, not unlike that of the artist. Control and communication animal machine is a proper study for the artist. So he's referencing there Norbert Wiener, of course. The Construction of Change was his first substantial reflection on the importance of cybernetics to his own creative processes. And it was, by extension, really a basis for his entire art production, as well as, obviously, the curriculum for the Ground Course. Now, in his studio, there was no official timetable. He developed a way of teaching art that was not based on the traditional master and apprentice system. Instead, he made behavior and process important elements of the course. And they tutor set projects, including using analog devices like you can see here. So this is a photograph of a calibrator, which is made out of cardboard, which has wheels that rotate and move and change for setting different parameters. And you could select human characteristics and behavioral alterations in a random but systematic fashion. And you could construct your own exercise through this. Again, no way to access computing technology, but they could think about things in a computational way. Here's some mind maps, which are, this is a photograph of one of the walls in the classroom. They've been tacked up onto the studio wall. And you can see that students are working through some ideas about, systems and how you might use a system to control art. So what Ascot was really teaching here was a cooperation interdependence. And some of the important artists of the day came to join him and teach there, including Harold and Bernard Cohen. Harold Cohen is, has a big retrospective exhibition opening this week in a London commercial gallery. And artists such as Ron Katai and other people came to teach on the course, including Gustav Metzger, who was a guest lecturer. Now, Gustave Metzger, again, very important name for British cybernetic art. He invented autodestructive art, and that is art works with the capacity to destroy themselves after a finite existence. And here's one of his most famous activities, which is the acid action painting event that took place on the South Bank in 1961. And this is a photograph of the performance in which he sprayed 3 large nylon sheets, which were colored white, black, and red. He sprayed them with hydrochloric acid. You can see the artist standing there in the middle, covered in a protective suit, spraying the acid. Of course, seconds later, they began to disintegrate, and nothing was left apart from the ragged remnants. Now, Metzger went on to produce the Destructive and Art Symposium of 1966, and this attracted famous artists, including Yoko Ono, who did that cut piece, which you may have heard about, where she invited members of the audience to come and cut her clothing off her body. So this became very important in the avant-garde movement, autodestructive art. Metzger himself was one of the first artists to actually detail a specific use of a computer in relation to his practice. And his Manifesto of 1961 declares his interest in computer-controlled cybernetic systems. And this is a sheet of information that was handed out to his demonstration on the South Bank there, and it contains a number of excerpts from his manifestos. He also, and I put here a close-up of this, he also put here some materials that you could use for creating art, and we've got cybernetics, as well as elasticity and electricity and electrolysis and electronics and feedback. These things weren't particularly well known about at this time, but they could be considered new techniques that the artist needed to address. Metzger's big project, which was never realized, although it does describe very much his ideas around this thinking, was his big project called 5 Screens with Computer. And here you can see a page from the Cybernetics Serendipity catalog in which he describes this. And there is a drawing at the screen, which only shows 4 of the screens, but originally it was going to have 5 screens, and it was a computer-controlled environmental work which would degrade after a period of about 10 years. It would basically self-destruct. And it was made up of these giant walls that would eject elements. And this is a metal model showing how the screens could have been installed. It was supposed to be set up in an urban environment where the people who lived nearby could have some bearing on the action of the work and could influence its destruction. Now, Metzger gave a talk at Ealing, which was extremely influential upon the students of Roy Ascot's ground course, including one student who was Pete Townsend, later went on to create the band The Who, and invented auto-destructive rock by smashing his guitar on stage. And here you can see just one of numerous pictures of him doing this over the years. Another visitor who came to Ealing and was extremely influential upon the students there was Gordon Pask, member of the British Cybernetics School. And he was concerned with the role that computers and information technologies could play in making a positive contribution to our lives. As a student at Cambridge, Gordon Pask had met Norbert Wiener. And here you can see Pask himself and one of his important books, again, very influential for artists. Here is Musicolor, which is one of Pask's early works from about 1953 and probably the first cybernetically controlled performance system in the UK. And it was a machine that he built himself, and it really crossed the fields of art, music, performance, and science. My colleague Nip Lambert has actually said that as an example of an early piece of interactive art, it was so far ahead of its time that the vocabulary to describe it really didn't exist. But it was a kind of interactive performance machine. And he, in fact, gave performances. And here you can see a photograph of the stage on the left and a handbill from the theater where he did a performance. The performer was able to play the machine and light and sound came out. So this really was a true joint project of human-machine interchange. The human performer didn't control the performance, nor did the machine control the performance. So in 1964, Pask gave a lecture at Ealing about systems theory and cybernetics, and this had a big impact on staff and students. Gordon Pask's own company was called Systems Research, and a young George Mellon went to work there after he'd finished his national service. And here you can see a photograph which has only just been discovered, so it's really very exciting, of George Mellon leaning against the blackboard in Pask's company in Richmond, Systems Research. Well, the 1960s were a time of major revolution in the arts, and many traditional critical frameworks were being questioned, undermined, and replaced. And there was a really pervasive sense of failure that somehow or other, the great achievements of European art, which many had assumed to be the pinnacle of human achievement, had counted for nothing when the great social catastrophe of the 20th century unfolded, particularly the wars. And so perhaps the art world had become fatally separated from the society in which it sought to represent. And into this debate came the technological optimism of the Cybernetics School. So it is not difficult to imagine the impact that this would have upon a group of young artists, young students who were seeking new beginnings at this time. George Mellon himself later on set up his own company and became interested in the computer as a medium for modeling complex systems. He saw the techniques of simulation were emerging as powerful new aids to decision-making and planning. And I've just finished writing a book about Mellon's big interdisciplinary interactive work, The Eco Game of 1970, which was the UK's first multiplayer interactive computer-driven gaming system, as well as being a piece of conceptual art in its own right. And this will be coming out, I hope, soon. So with the example of cybernetics, the computer could then have the potential to be more than just a design tool. It could also be an agent for allowing interactivity, and it could help artists to connect with their audience more and become a medium for simulation. Here you can see Brian Eno, who was another student of Roy Ascot. Roy Ascot later moved to Ipswich Civic College, and he started a similar type of course, inspiring another generation of young people. You know Brian Eno, the famous musician. Ipswich became a hotbed of experimental art for a very brief time. One of the other people teaching at Ipswich was Stroud Cornuck, and he was a Royal College of Art trained sculptor. And here you can see him pictured on the lower left with a calibrator type analog device hanging around his neck, and he is creating an interactive participatory artwork with his students on this piece of scaffolding. And again, he had the belief that any medium had validity for artistic activity. Now, Stephen Willets was another one of the students on Ascot's original ground course at Ealing, and he subsequently went with Ascot to Ipswich to teach as well. And here he is surrounded by some of his students. So we can see that what we're looking at here is generation after generation, taking these ideas of cybernetics and interactivity and connectivity with the audience into their art. And this is very different from the prevailing model, which held that the artist was a solitary, isolated creative genius living in an ivory tower, completely separated from the real world. Here you can see some of Stephen Willets's work. He produced a manifesto, which he used to give out. He produced several manifestos. He used to give them out at gallery openings. And I've just picked one, which I thought was quite interesting. The realization of the potential of the conceptual model and its field of behavior proposed by the artist is cognition. And here's a page from his notebook where you can see he's really talking about artists on the left moving through input from the stimulus, their environment, the effects of the environment coming off on the right, being fed back into the environment, and the whole thing kind of informing the next iteration. Stephen Willets, again, was really interested in how can an artwork involve genuine participation so that the interaction would create a more dynamic exchange between artist and audience. And his practice uses cybernetics as a mode of questioning how art could function in society. His early work takes the form of these diagrammatic drawings and conceptual models. And in this, he's influenced by people like Ross Ashby and Gordon Pask. And Willets really became a pioneer of conceptual art and socially engaged art in the 1970s, working interactively with various audiences, particularly those in housing estates. And here's just a small example of some of his work, some of his books, which address that. Many of his ideas came together in Metafilter, which was an interactive machine involving two participants who had a conversation mediated through the machine, responding to questions and attempting to reach a state of agreement. This work, Metafilter, is now in the museum in Lyon in France. Well, the great interest in cybernetics and art in Britain culminated in the exhibition Cybernetics Serendipity at the ICA in 1968. And this was the first gallery show of its type and certainly the first of its kind in Britain, and drew together leading artists from around the world, about 325 participants from a wide range of disciplines, including painting, plotter drawings, dance, music, animation, poetry, film, sculpture, and a scaled down version toured around to Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and also on to Japan. And of course, Gordon Pask's work, Colloquy of Mobiles, which you can see just a small portion of to the right of the screen there, was also involved in the exhibition. And you can see another work on the right of this installation shot of cybernetic work as well. Now, colloquy of mobiles has been here's another view of it. You can see some plotter drawings in the background. It has been recreated by the College of Creative Studies in Detroit, driven by modern technology, modern digital software, and it's now on view at the ZKM Museum in Germany. And I think you're going to get a talk by Paul Pangaro later in this seminar series, and I'm sure he'll go into this in more depth. But again, it's a very early interactive cybernetic artwork. Now, one of the aims of cybernetic serendipity was to show the scope of what was possible, emphasizing the optimistic and celebratory nature of the undertaking. And it was an enormously influential exhibition upon a generation of younger people, what might be termed second generation computer artists who saw it. And in the wake of cybernetic serendipity, a whole new world started opening up for computer art. And we had the creation of the Computer Arts Society first mooted in 1968 and officially founded in 1969. You can see the poster here for their first exhibition at the Royal College of Art called Event One, which is an interdisciplinary exhibition workshop type event. And this was also the first time, by the way, that a computer entered the Royal College of Art. And members from the society and visitors were able to use the machine, which came from the Imperial College, to make work during the weekend. Well, this new creative world was helped by advancements in technology as computers became less bulky and slightly less expensive as the 1960s progressed. And here you can see John Lansdowne, one of the founders of the Computer Arts Society, using a teletype in 1969, which obviously was an easier method of getting your instructions into the computer than using punched cards on a mainframe. And he's also able to do a little drawing as well. All of this, here's another example of John Lansdowne using the teletype equipment. Here he is making computer-generated notations for dance, and he's working with students of the Royal Ballet. And he was filmed by the BBC and received quite a lot of publicity for his dance, his computer-generated dance. Well, all of this excitement led Gustave Metzger, who became an early member of the Computer Arts Society, to write, if 500 artists were now to enter computer art, they would find it difficult to exhaust the technical and aesthetic possibilities of the existing mechanisms. Well, there's a lot more than 500 artists using digital technologies now, and it's still not exhausted. And of course, there were books that began to be published, all influential in the early to mid 70s. You've got Herbert Franke's Computer Graphics, Computer Art up there at the top of 1971. That was translated by Metzger from the German. And Yasha Reichardt, the curator of cybernetic serendipity, her book, Cybernetic Art and Ideas, and Science and Technology and Art Today, about 1972, and that has on the cover another work by Edward Ignatovich, The Sound Activated Mobile, or SAM, and Artist and Computer, edited by Ruth Levitt, again, very influential book from about the mid-1970s. However, computers were still very elaborate, complex machines, and gaining access for artists was going to be a major hurdle. So most artists had to learn to write code themselves, as we saw Lansdowne doing in the last image, or to cultivate make a relationship with a technician with whom they could collaborate and access the equipment. And such relationships were helped by the creation of the polytechnics towards the end of the 1960s in Britain. And these were combinations of hitherto separate colleges of art and technologies, art colleges of technologies and art schools. And what the polytechnics did was gather these under one umbrella organization. And this is particularly important for the gestation of computer arts because it meant that people from different disciplines could cooperate more easily because they were all part of one organization. So artists could have the chance to access computer systems which generally belong to the maths department, for example. And that's in fact what happened here at Lanchester Polytechnic in Coventry, where Clive Richards, who was a graphic designer, was able to meet Ron Johnson, who was a computer programmer. And Ron Johnson told him, I have a machine that can draw. Of course, that is a fascinating thing for an artist, and the two collaborated, and this resulted in a film, Spinning Gazebo, which was the first computer animated film made in a British art school. And as I said, these art schools really became incubators of computer arts during the 1970s. Ernest Edmonds also worked with Stroud Cornock, who we previously mentioned at the City of Leicester Polytechnic. And here you can see on the lower bottom of the screen, Ernest Edmonds working at his teletype. And the other photograph shows Edmonds and Stroud Cornock creating a piece called Datapack, which worked over long distances where people could cooperate. I mean, in this case, they're just in separate rooms, but the theory was you could cooperate over long distances to produce artworks. And the bottom right of the screen shows some of the printouts which came about as a result of that Datapack artwork, which was very early artwork involving cybernetics at the City of Leicester. Now, City of Leicester was very advanced because it actually had one computer in the whole of the institution. And it was formed from a College of Technology merging with a College of Art in 1969. And Ernest Edmonds has told me that the director of the college became the director of the art college, rather, became the director of the whole polytechnic. And he felt that this was a great advantage to them to actually get some art going in the educational institution. These polytechnics later, of course, became universities much later. I have got a book coming out, in fact, next month with Ernest Edmonds, which contains an interview between Ernest and I talking about the impact of cybernetics on his work. And so that might be something that some of you might be interested in. Ernest Edmonds also has an exhibition opening in January at the Mossman Gallery in New South Wales. So that might also be of interest to some people who are in Australia. The show is going to include work by Edmonds' students as well as himself. All of this information is in the snack pack, which will be available on the School of Cybernetics website after the talk. Well, finally, I'm going to mention one more example of an artist working in an art school. And this is, of course, the Slade School of Art, where a pioneering computer art curriculum was established in 1974 by systems artist, Malcolm Hughes. And he set up a studio with computing equipment, as you can see here, much of which the students constructed or adapted themselves. And here is a student, Dominic Borum, producing a work on the teletype, which he is actually able to preview on the green screen. You can see a small oscilloscope green screen on the far side of the photograph. The Slade became a bit of a hotbed for artistic activity, computer art activity in the UK, particularly for artists interested in generative forms and cellular autonoma. Paul Brown was one of the students, and here you can see one of his works from that time. Well, this research was published by me in 2008, and recently this book has been reissued as an ebook. So if you have any interest in this, you can go ahead and download that. It's got a few slight updates, the ebook. You can find it available online. And you can also follow me on Instagram, where I post snippets of history about this field. And I mentioned at the beginning that when I started on the journey of art and cybernetics, very few people were interested. Well, I'm very pleased to say that this is now changing. And I can actually even report that very recently at the Venice Biennale this year in 2022, Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, an artist using computing technologies, was presented with a special mention award. And you can see here the award was presented by the Biennale for the following motivation: for indexing the cybernetic concerns that run through the exhibitions in an illuminating and powerful way that also includes visionary moments of her early practice that foresaw the influence of technology in our everyday lives. So I think that people are starting to recognize that as technology does have a major impact on our everyday lives, we need to consider the artists who are using it, and we need to give them a bit more of a voice. So I'm pleased to say that this appears to be very much changing now, something like 20 years later. Anyway, I just want to thank you very much for having me.
Want more? Check out the snack pack in the video description for bonus content and resources.